Hello everyone and welcome back once again to ThursDev. I'm your host Luke, and today I'm going to be continuing our talk on metrics-aware game design. But before we do, I'd like to backpedal a bit, as I realize that I've done things a little bit out of order. My intent was to go more into depth on the actual designs that could be implemented to speak on retention in games, but instead I jumped ahead to conversion last time, so I'd like to continue where we left off previously and course correct by revisiting retention and talking a little bit about the act of designing game mechanics that speak to the management of session length and frequency of game sessions. Sequence weirdness aside, if you watched the third video in this series, you may remember me talking about building a player pattern profile for your game. If you haven't watched that one yet, I suggest having a quick watch for a refresher, as the concepts discussed here tie in closely with those of the previous video. This week, we're going to take that profile into consideration and take a brief look at the main concepts that one should be bearing in mind about games that fit into each type of profile and what we should consider when designing these games in order to best promote retention. In the case of the short session game, you know that your player will be engaging with your game in brief but energetic bursts, and that probably also implies that you want more numerous sessions in any given day. In order to build play patterns that accommodate this, we need to design mechanics that reward the player for participating in multiple features during a session, extending individual session time, and also we have to encourage the players to return to the game regularly or after a certain period of time. In order to lengthen our short session game's individual playtime, the easiest way is to design a system that offers the player the opportunity to play multiple rounds in the game for differing or increasing rewards. This can be anything from a bonus for multiple rounds played in a short period of time, or even though it may sound counterintuitive, by offering a limited time to do a certain task, which will put pressure on the player to engage with that mechanic before the time runs out or miss out on a potential reward. Time pressure is a strong influencer for keeping players engaged, and not only can it coax a player into engaging more at once, it can also coax them into engaging more often. By having a system of rewards in place that are delayed reaction, we can condition our players to access your game more often in order to collect those rewards and most likely set another group of rewards in motion. This is most commonly seen in timer-based gameplay like build timers, unlock timers on reward boxes, skill training timers, and old-fashioned stamina systems. With many frequent individual rounds expected in a day, the short-form game is incentivized to switch up its gameplay often, offering variants to the core loop, be it through the ability to modify the way that game plays, or by offering a separate mode, leagues, events, and so on. Though, like all of the examples on today's list, they apply to any game, it sees the most effect in the short-form game, as the experience is much more likely to become stale when the player repeats the core loop every 5 to 10 minutes. Another thing to keep in mind with short session games is that the player typically engages with these games with the expectation that play will be quick and not last so long that it can't be considered a momentary distraction. Put more crudely, it's expected that the player will be able to complete a single session during a bathroom break. To this end, though we would always want to strive for great presentation, we should also be very conscious of how much time we're spending not allowing our players to actually play. The less friction that we have in allowing our players to get to the part of the game that they came for, the better retention will be. This is one of those reasons why a short and engaging fatui is imperative, and why narrative is difficult in short session games. Even a lengthy presentation before and after a specific part of gameplay can cause stress on the play experience. When you only have 5 minutes, you want your player to actually be playing for at least 4.5 of those. In the medium session game, many of the session length techniques of the short session game hold true as well. Rewarding consistent play is a strong way to maintain player interest, and including limited time actions will encourage lengthier sessions, but the medium session game is a slightly harder sell than the short for convincing the player to play multiple rounds for rewards alone, since rewards are going to be likely less frequent. The medium session game does, however, have the benefit of strong emotional response to both successes and failures due to having invested more time and personal energy into an individual round of your game. You should be designing with maximizing the impact of the results of a round of your game, as, though the short session game benefits from this as well, the medium session game will see the greatest results from a satisfying win or a particularly narrow loss. Celebratory moments will be extremely impactful in these cases, making a win feel sweeter, and making a loss, assuming the loss is a satisfying one, fun enough to make a player want to try harder is going to be a valuable endeavor. This will necessitate very careful balancing, as you'll need to tune your gameplay to come as close to draws without resulting frequently in draws as possible. You want to design your game to give your player the narrowest wins and the nearest losses that you can, because that's where we feel the most accomplished and the most motivated to try again. A 50-50 win rate honestly is what you should be aiming for. Dominating is fun for the power gamer, but psychologically, you'll see more satisfaction from overcoming a challenge than from an easy win. Likewise, hopeless odds also lead to player churn. That buildup of tension as difficulty mounts, only to explode in a last-second victory or painful but entertaining loss, is what makes gaming the most interesting. In comparison, though balance is always something to strive for, more liberties can be taken with the short-form game, and more imbalances can occur, as a win or loss will be, by definition, less impactful, and the long-form game struggles to attain perfect balance because the longer the session, the more variables there will inevitably be, contributing too much to swings in one direction or another. The long session game is very different from short and medium, as its goals are different. The long session game focuses much less on return rate and throws down most of its cards on session length and immediate retention. If your game's narrative driven, that's the most obvious place to begin. Where the short form game needs to truncate its narrative in order to facilitate a game's session length, when the player sits down to play an RPG, presentation and narrative are an expectation. The long session game builds retention through pacing in both its storytelling and its gameplay, but actually is incentivized to be a little more stingy with its rewards or drop smaller rewards with frequency with the promise of big things to come. To increase already long session length and to maintain retention in the long form game, in the same way that you'll be introducing plot points at a controlled drip, the game should always be introducing new goals for the player to strive towards. The RPG has leveling and the progression of power and collection of gear as a fantastic way to keep players forging onward, since the player will always see the next big thing coming up and want to achieve it before stopping. If there's always a concrete goal ahead of the player, they'll want to achieve it. This is one of the failings of many open world games. There are carrots on sticks out in the world, but the player needs to find them first. Leading your player to carrots, as it were, by always giving them something in their immediate path to follow is a good idea. Let them stray if they want, but the best open world experiences still railroad the player to a certain extent. And for that straying player, you'll also find that you can create a fair amount of organic retention by focusing on completionist mechanics like hidden items, item sets, and collectibles. A finely tuned progression plan will be necessary to maintain player interest, and surfacing that out to the player will also serve to build that interest with the player, along with carefully timing out the rate at which these rewards are given. To that end, you'll also want to consider content gating to a certain extent, requiring the player to work through certain goals in order to unlock the best content that your game has to offer, as nothing quite weakens the impact of rewards in a game like giving away the farm entirely. If your player can just walk straight to the best equipment in the game right away, where's the fun of searching for any other gear in the game? If the boss is always killable from the start of the game, what's the fun in working your way up the ranks? Consider creating some gates for the content in your game's primary progression. Progression, of course, also feeds into product lifespan for all the aforementioned session lengths, in that you always want to be tempting your players with something interesting just visible on the horizon for players to interact with. In the case of the long session game, this could be an important narrative plot point or a level that unlocks something cool to do, where the short session game is more likely to have large rewards or new play modes opening to the player as a proverbial carrot. Though most, if not all, of these mechanics should be nothing particularly new for you as a game developer, it's useful to understand both their potential impact on retention and the value they bring to your game. Depending on your own bandwidth, it's worth evaluating how well they might fit into your game and whether you can implement them within your development time and cost budget. If you can make space for them, however, it's always worth trying to add a little incentive to the player to put that much extra time into your game, as investment of time leads to continued interest. The more time that you can convince a player to spend in your game in the beginning, the more likely they will be to stick around to the end. And that's it for today's episode. Now that I've talked your ear off about retention mechanics, next time I'd like to start thinking together about conversion mechanics. We've got our players sticking around in our game and maybe even staying in your game for a while at a time. If your game is a premium title, you may have less need for the next few lessons, but you may yet learn something, even if you don't intend to add microtransactions or DLC to your game. Regardless though, next week is the dreaded money talk. How to make a payer out of a player without compromising your game's value. Thank you for joining me, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed this episode of ThursDev, and welcome again to the brand new Level 0 Gamedev channel. If you happened upon us from elsewhere on the web and this is your first time here, welcome. This is our new Gamedev focused channel where we talk about game development, game news, and all sorts of things industry related. If you're looking for lighthearted Let's Plays with the eye of a game developer or two, consider checking out our parent channel, Level 0 NPCs, as well. And if you aren't a subscriber already, I'd be thrilled if you decided to join this little cadre of game enthusiasts who love both the playing and creation of games. But even if you're just passing through, thank you for watching today, and I hope that I'll see you around here again soon. Until then though, have a good one, and take care.